So centering, I do mostly with my fingertip, but just to be on the safe side, I give it a little shave to make sure that's even. And then I'm going to open the top of this. A fingertip is a little much, so I'm going to use my little spoon thing. You could use the end of a popsicle stick. You can carve your own little tools. Anything that's got a tiny little spoon shape or a rounded shape at the end is good for this. In this case, for a teapot, I don't want that top opening to get very wide, so I'm going to keep it a straight up and down cylinder, and I'm going to widen the inside of it. I'm going to widen the belly of it without letting the rim get too big. I want to thin the walls. For some reason, I'm adamant that my teapots have to actually pour tea. I'm going to slow this down a little now that I'm centered. But yeah, I want my teapots to be functional. They have to have a spout that works and a lid that fits. But if you see, I'm just kind of pushing out to belly out the center of this, while I'm leaving the top as narrow as possible. I'm not worried that it's getting all misshapen on the top because I can trim that up later. I want to have the little throwing marks on the outside of my teapot, so I can throw up and in a little bit. And this again is a place where I'm going to use my little needle tool to remove the part I don't need, that little uneven extra on the rim. I want my teapot to be as fat as possible with that, and I want to leave my opening as narrow as possible. So I'm just going to keep going in there, and I'm using this like a spatula on the edge of a bowl. I'm just kind of using the edge of it so that the clay is squirting past it. I don't want to scoop clay. I don't want to cut the clay. And then, of course, I use my paintbrush on the rim. I don't want it to be a wet paintbrush because I don't want to add any more water to this clay than I already have. It's very small, and if it gets too wet, it's going to want to collapse. But I can use this paintbrush in the way that I would use maybe a chamois to finish a rim and a finished pot. And then when it's time to shape this, I can use my blade, and again, I'm using this like I'm buttering bread. It's squirting past it at an angle. So I can use it just to kind of shape that without cutting anything off. And then I'm also going to take the extra clay off the bottom like I have in the past. I can cut in that far and then just go back and take this extra clay off the base. So now I've got a shape for a teapot body. I need to refine this rim a little bit. I'll use the edge of a blade for that. And in this case, I am removing some clay. I'm just kind of scraping off to get an opening that's a good size for me. I'll do it this way as well. So really, once you've got your piece expanded, you're going to use tools mostly just to remove clay. And tools work a lot better than fingertips. They're not going to over wet your clay. You're not going to have the same kind of problems working with tools that you run into when you're throwing with your hands. It's hard to overwork these. It's hard to over wet these. And there we go. So if I know that this is the shape of my teapot so far, and I know I'm going to have to make a lid that fits this teapot, I also know that I'm not going to turn this onto its rim to trim it like I would other pots. So I want to make sure that I've got the bottom of this shaped the way I want it. Let me turn that up a little bit because I need the torque. These wheels don't have a ton of torque, and so if you go too slowly, you can easily stop the wheel just by pressing on the surface. But I want to finish the shape of the foot of this teapot, including giving it a little bit of an undercut here so that it has a kind of a shadow underneath it, so that it isn't, ooh, that's a horrible noise. So that it looks finished. It's got a little shadow underneath. But I also know that I'm going to have to make a lid for this. So I use a paper clip to make myself calipers. So I know how big to make the lid. So I want to set this so that it's measuring the size of the inside of this opening. Because when I make a lid, it's going to have a little, the part that goes down in needs to be that wide. So there, that's my caliper. I need to set it aside and remember what it's set to, so that when it's time to make a lid for this, I can measure this and make sure that it'll drop right back into my teapot. I'm going to very gently cut this guy off. You can sometimes, in a piece like this, instead of using a needle, I can cut this with an X-Acto blade very gradually from the outside in. It's a nice idea to let it dry for a second, or long enough that I can pick this up without putting a fingerprint on it. So if you've got something flat, a little card or a knife blade or something that'll allow you to pick this up and move it without getting fingerprints on the surface. Okay, in order to make the other pieces for this teapot, it's going to need a lid, it's going to need a spout, and it's going to need a handle. The lid and the spout, I'm going to throw, this is called throwing off the hump, because I'm only centering one little piece, and then I'm going to throw the parts I need off the top of this. So the first thing I'd like to do is make a lid. I made myself the little calipers out of the paper clip that's going to show me what size my lid needs to be, how wide my lid needs to be. So I want the top of this to be wider than what I'm going to require for the lid. It's the part that drops down in is going to need to be that width. So I'm going to flatten this down a little so I can see what I'm doing. You can always center by removing some clay on a piece this size. Okay, so the gallery that drops down in the pot needs to be this wide. So I'm going to open this like it's a shallow little bowl, and I'm going to use this piece of jewelry that has this tiny little spoon at the end. I'm going to open this from the center and push outward, and that little piece that rises up there becomes the part that drops down into the top of my teapot. So I keep checking the width. That looks about right. And remember, you're only going to touch the clay where it's spinning away from you. If you touch it where it's spinning toward you, it's going to catch and tear your clay. So I'm working at about 7 o'clock on this circle. I'm just going to keep checking and make sure see if it fits there, it's going to fit in my teapot. And notice that it leans in like this, because you need it to be able to go in easily and then get closer and closer to the teapot rim until it nests. If you make it a straight-sided thing, it's going to rattle, and you don't want your teapot lid to rattle, even if it's a teeny tiny teapot. It's just bad form. So there's my lid. It's upside down. If I want to, I can sort of check it by seeing whether the teapot's going to fit well on there. But my calipers pretty much make that a done deal. It's got that little bit of a raggedy edge, and I'm going to use my teeny tiny paintbrush just to smooth that down a little bit. But remember that the angle should be leaning inward when it's upside down. I'm going to round this edge a little bit. And then I got to do this carefully because these go flying without warning. I'm just going to go ahead and cut this teapot off while I'm kind of shaping it to be rounded. So I'm just going in there with my X-Acto blade. I'm not really worried about the clay underneath it. That'll be cleaned up later. I'm going to slide in there. I could do this with a pin tool also. And then little by little, I'm separating it from its base until I've got a little lid on my spoon there. And I'm going to set this aside. All right, so when I make a spout, I want a spout to have a taper. I want it to be able to kind of nest to the side of the pot and then taper upward. And so I'm throwing off the hump like I did with the lid. And I'm going to basically start out with a little volcano form. I wouldn't do this on a regular size pot, but it's really kind of complicated to close clay that's this small while you've got an opening in it. So I'm going to start out with kind of a funnel shape, and then I'm going to make a hole like this. I want to use the rounded end of this, and I'm going to wet it slightly. But I'm going to do like I did with the other pot, where I'm kind of widening it out at the base, because I want this. I mean, this is super picky. I could basically hand build a spout and poke a hole in it and call it a working teapot spout. It's only going to pour a drop at a time anyway. But I kind of like the challenge of being able to throw a spout for a teapot at this scale. So I want to make sure this hole stays open. And at the same time, I want to continue to shape this spout so that it goes from wide to narrow. And ideally, a spout should be a little longer than you need it, because you'll cut off the ends that don't work for you. So I want the tip to be too pointy, and I want the base to be too wide. And then I can choose exactly what I need to go on my teapot. And I'm going to slow this down and do my cut off here. And set this guy aside. Okay, so it's time to put my teapot together. So I've got this little lid, and it's stiffened up to the point where I can mess with it without worrying that I'm going to hurt it. It's gotten to about the consistency of, I don't know, like a chocolate bar. It's not dry and crumbly yet, but it's still soft enough that I can trim it, but I'm not going to squish it by picking it up. It's maybe like cheddar cheese. So I make a little bullseye on this clay pad, and I want to make sure this is centered and give him a little push. I'm going to be super gentle with this guy because he's very, very small, and he might want to go flying. In fact, it might be smart for me, now that I see where he fits, to go ahead and scoop that out so he has a little dent to sit in. I don't know for sure that it's a he. Like that. So I've got it in place, and all I really need to do to this is trim that top so that it looks nice, so that it looks finished. It's got a few little crumb spots on there. I'd like it to look finished, and I'd also like it to look like it was thrown. You want to make sure that the inside edge of your trimming tool, or your actually the little staple is a good one, but you want to make sure that they're clean and don't have clay on them, because it cuts best if it's just clean metal. So all I really want to do here is take off the crumbs. And clean up that outside edge a little bit.
And if we can cut when you have a sec.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to remove my little pad here and use this as a work table. I've got my teapot body, and I've got my little lid, and this is the moment of truth. Yes, the lid fits nicely. Okay. And again, I'm going to cut this at a kind of a curved angle like this, so that it'll meet the side of the pot. I maybe like that one a little better. It's got a little more heft to it. It's a fat-bodied teapot. So I'm going to open out that opening and make it nice and wide. And I want to sort of test it on that surface. I think that's a nicer spot for that. So the tip I will trim later, but for now I'm going to attach this spout to the pot. What I tend to do is wet the base of it, put it where I want it, make sure that the tip is at the right level. And then when I pull this off, you can see a wet spot here where the spout just was. And that tells me where to score. So I'm going to take a sharp edged piece, a needle or in this case my blade. I'm going to scratch this up really well all around that area where the spout's going to go. And because it's a spout, I'm also going to make a hole there for my spot of tea to come out. Okay? Then I'm going to do the same thing to the inside edge of this spout. I'm going to score it really well. Even tiny pots, you really have to scratch and attach, because if I were to stick two wet things together, they only stick as long as they're wet. And then as soon as they dry, they'll pop back apart. So when I attach that, people spend a lot of time trying to erase the join when they put two pieces together. But I was taught to, Tony Clinell says, celebrate the marriage. You want to make it clear how this was put together. And so if a line disappears, I tend to draw it back in because it's going to show you how this teapot was made. I tend to put things on a little roughly at first and then go back later to refine it once it's had a chance to stiffen up a little bit. If you mess with things too much while they're still wet, you kind of overwork the clay and it starts to look overly pinched. I want to make a little angle on my spout, like that. I don't want it to be straight up and down like the end of a garden hose, but I don't want to be a horizontal either, like a coffee pot. So somewhere in between there, you get a spout that seems generous enough to pour. All right, so there's my spout, and there's my lid. And all we have left to decide about is a handle. Mm-hmm. I can do a handle that goes up and over like this, or I can do a handle like a coffee cup handle that goes on the top. Because this is so tall, I think having a little bit of up and over like that would be the most attractive approach. So that's the handle I'll make. For a handle to be in proportion for a teapot this size, it's going to have to be pretty thin. For my full-size teapots, I pull the clay, I wet it and do what's called a pulled handle. But for this size teapot, that's kind of impossible. But I want this to look like a pulled handle. I roll the coil as thin as possible and as even as possible. But I want this to look like a pulled handle and not like a coil. So one of the things that I can do is to press something down the middle to give it that mark that my thumb would have made if I were pulling this handle. So I've got a little bit of a kind of a ditch down the center of it there, okay? That flattens it a little bit. It makes it look smoother. And what I tend to do is sort of picture where I want this handle to go, and then set it down for a minute in that curve. Now clay is going to dry very quickly when it's this size and this scale. You know when you're hand building anything that it starts getting crunchy pretty quickly. So I'm just going to leave this to dry in the curve that I'd like to see it in. It's going to attach right here, right where the spout meets the the body. And so I'm going to start to kind of score up that spot. And then it's going to curve up and over and attach back here at about the same height. I always kind of have to look straight down the spout to make sure that I've got it in the right spot. Though there's something to be said for wonky handles. Those can be kind of fun too. So I'm not adding a ton of water to this. I just have to make sure that that is really hamburgered up right there, because these are very, very small and they want to come off. And same thing here. I'm just dipping the tip of my X-Acto blade in water to make sure that there's lots of mud on there. So just as a reminder, wet clay will stick to wet clay as long as it's wet, but as soon as it dries, it's going to fall off unless it's doing something like this, unless you've got some Velcro going on. So when I mess up the end of this and the piece that I'm attaching and push them together, the clay bonds to itself, and that will hold it in place. So here's my handle. I could speed the drying by setting this on a piece of paper or on a piece of wood, but I kind of want to get a feeling for how tall is practical. Probably right about there. So I'm going to score this end just like I did the teapot. And I'm not super careful when I'm scoring this, because I can go back in with a paintbrush and clean up any of the mess that forms. But I want to attach this here without really overworking it. I want to be able to see the line. I'm not going to try to blend this together so it looks like a factory made coffee cup. I mean, people kind of obsess about erasing all signs of their handwork. I'm just going to make sure that it's pressed into place, and I'm not going to overwork that. And if I curve it here and take a look, you want to make sure that your pot and your handle are about the same moisture content, because if clay shrinks when it dries. And so if I wait too long to do this and my teapot has started to shrink, and then I add my handle, then when my handle shrinks, it's going to pop right off of the pot, and I don't want that to happen. So if your teapot is drying and you make a handle while you're waiting for your handle to dry, it's a good idea to cover your teapot so that it doesn't keep drying faster than your handle. So I'm going to very gently set that there, and then I'll give it a little push. Use a little blade here just to push it into place. And again, I don't want to overwork this. I can always come back later when it's had a little chance to dry and clean up the messy spots. But the more I do that with wet clay, the more it just disguises my lines and muddies up those nice smooth edges. So the thing about a handle is you want to pay attention not so much to the handle, the shape of the handle, but the shape of the space between the handle and the pot. That's true of putting a handle on a mug or anything else. You want to look at the negative space, the shape of this opening. It should be a pleasant shape. It should have some kind of angle that reminds you of the shape of the pot below it. In this case, I might lean this forward a little bit. Since the gravity, the weight of this is pulled this way by the handle, I could lean it back a little bit, but I kind of like it better this way. So play around with it. Also be aware that it's likely to warp some as it dries. When these guys are done, if I really want to make sure that they dry evenly without warping, I'll sometimes just take a drinking glass and put it over the top of it. That way, if the tip of the spout is a little wet, or if the bottom of the pot is a little dry, or if parts of this aren't drying evenly, if they're trapped under the cup, it gives it a chance to all kind of equalize. It keeps the humidity in there even. So I can see a few places where I'm going to want to come back with a paintbrush. Watch, look from the front and make sure it's straight up and down. I can see a few spots that I'm going to want to clean up later with a teeny little paintbrush. But in general, I feel like this little pot is done. The thing I want to do before I call it done is to take my little signature chop and sign the bottom, just like I would if it was a regular size pot. Okay, so that guy, all I really need to do is make sure that it dries slowly enough, and then make sure you don't ever lift it by its handle until after it's glazed and fired, because it's on there, but it's a very, very small piece of clay, so the joints are very small and precarious.